For today's video, I've gotten my hands on a vehicle with one of the longest names in the industry. This is the 2022 Volvo C40 Recharge Ultimate P8e all-wheel drive. In this video, I'm going to unpack that name and we're going to talk about all the viewer questions that I got when I recently drove this at the launch event. So in this video, it's not going to be quite as detailed as usual. Instead, I'm going to focus on how this drives, its performance scores, what kind of range you can expect, and everything you need to know if you're considering a C40 for your next purchase. Volvo is calling the C40 their first dedicated electric vehicle, but in reality, the C40 is just a style-forward interpretation of the XC40. It shares the vast majority of the hardware, including the all-electric drivetrain, with the XC40 Recharge, and the XC40, of course, was designed to support plug-in hybrid and regular gasoline drivetrains as well. Versus the XC40, this is certainly more style-forward up front. It has a sleeker, cleaner look with a bit more of a dedicated shield here rather than an imitation grille. It has the latest LED headlight technology from Volvo and LED fog lights below. Of course, all the cooling is going on down here with just a little bit right here just below that Volvo logo. The C40 Recharge and the XC40 Recharge have another close cousin in the United States, the Polestar 2. The Polestar 2 is styled a bit more like a sedan or a liftback, and it's trying to compete more directly with the Tesla Model 3. But the C40 and the XC40, aside from one another, they don't have much direct competition in the United States, because these are subcompact luxury crossovers, sized more like a BMW X2 or X1 than an X3, or that next category up where we see the Tesla Model Y. Now, the new Genesis GV60 is only a little bit longer than this, but on the inside it is certainly more compact crossover sized than subcompact sized like we find in the C40, but price-wise it's definitely a solid competitor. As you'd expect out of a modern crossover, there's plenty of body cladding going on. The C40 has unique wheels and staggered tires, interestingly enough. 235 with tires up front, 255 with tires in the rear. If you're trying to decide between the C40 and the XC40, you should know that the C40 has reduced cargo practicality and less headroom in the back than we find in the XC40, thanks to the sleeker profile. But I think this looks absolutely fantastic. I love the design, and I love the modern tail lamp and headlight treatments that we get in here. It has amber turn signals, lots of reflectors in here, and sort of a dashed pattern as this tail lamp module goes from the top of the vehicle down across the side and then right back there to the liftgate lid. Be sure and let me know what you think about the design of the C40 down there in the comment section. I think this is easily the most attractive small crossover in the luxury segment. The C40's electric drivetrain is essentially shared with the XC40 Recharge and the Polestar 2, but there are some software differences between the three vehicles, and the software is the likely reason that the Polestar 2 is the fastest 0 to 60, this is the second fastest, and the XC40 Recharge is just a little bit slower, because the three vehicles are relatively similar in terms of curb weight, and they have very similar power figures as well. Also common between the three vehicles is the lithium-ion battery pack that's located mostly under the passenger compartment. It has a usable capacity of 75 kilowatt hours. Because this platform was originally designed for a gasoline engine to live up front, we do have a reasonably sized front trunk and storage area here. There's enough room for the EVSE that comes with the vehicle. Volvo does include a dual voltage EVSE, which is a really nice touch, and although this cannot max out the onboard charger, it does get pretty close. So for a lot of folks, you won't need to buy one yourself. Volvo could have made this storage area a little bit bigger because the divider is somewhat bulky, and then under the divider we have a foam insert with the can fix a flat tire inflator kit, etc. If you took all of that out of there, the front cargo area would definitely be a bit more usable. A lot of folks were asking, why didn't Volvo give us an even larger storage area? Why is there that funky divider in there? Well, most logically, it's because of crash safety. Volvo is absolutely obsessed with it. And in order to make sure that this vehicle's front end performs as they intend, they really don't want you to put large, bulky, and dense cargo under that hood storage area right there. If you were to put, for instance, a big bulky bag there, it could affect the way the crash structures would function in the event of an accident. The other reason, of course, is that the C40 has a standard heat pump, and that means that behind that storage area, there's a lot more plumbing involved than in a vehicle that just had a resistive element heater and an air conditioning compressor. Now, heat pumps are important if you plan on driving in winter weather. That's seriously going to have an impact on your range. Now, if you're still worried about winter weather performance for the heating system, because we have heard rumors of Tesla drivers being a little bit too chilly when the temperatures drop below zero, fear not, this one also has an auxiliary resistive element heater that will back up the heat pump in the event it can't put out enough heat. When designing the platform that the C40 rides on, Volvo had a three-pronged mission in mind. Design this to support not just battery electric vehicles like this, but also plug-in hybrid vehicles and gasoline vehicles with all-wheel drive. So there are going to be a few compromises in terms of the way this vehicle is packaged. For instance, we still have a driveline hump between the two rear passengers and of course between the driver and front passenger as well. The battery pack is located basically in this black area right here underneath the doors. The battery pack is not a full skateboard unit like we find in some EVs. It actually has cells removed where the rear passenger feet would go, and then it's double stacked just below the rear seat area. It also sort of clings on to the vehicle, so that does reduce ground clearance. You notice that the bottom of the vehicle down here is much lower than you'd find in the regular XC40. You'll really notice that if you park an XC40 Recharge and an XC40 gasoline vehicle right next to one another, that the battery does hang down there underneath the vehicle. This design choice means that on the inside this looks very much like a regular gasoline vehicle with that driveline hump, but it also means that we don't have your knees in your chest like you find in some electric conversions. Cargo practicality, but not necessarily cargo capacity, suffers versus the XC40. You can see that this cargo area is a little bit more liftback or sportback shaped than traditional hatchback shaped. I was able to fit three 24-inch roller bags across the back, and thanks to the added length of this, I was also able to fit a 22-inch roller bag back here, but I was able to squeeze a bit more in the XC40. The one downside for me, at least, with this cargo area is this cargo cover. It is one of the hard variety, so if you pull this out of the vehicle, it's a little bit more tricky to stick this somewhere than the roller shade style. As we see in other Volvos, there's some practical cargo touches like grocery bag holders right here integrated into the rear floor module, but the floor itself could have gone down a little bit lower. You can see that there's about 4 inches of extra room under the load floor. I would really have loved a 2-stage load floor so you could actually make use of some of that extra space. It might have let us put extra baggage in here. On the inside, we find the feature that every modern EV seems to need to have, which is a large glass moonroof that doesn't have any sort of shade, manual or powered. The driver and front passenger have height adjustable shoulder belts and, unusual for a Volvo, height adjustable headrests as well. The interior design is pretty similar to what we find in the XC40. We have color matched carpet and door panel inserts. The door panel insert right there is actually carpet, just like we find on the floor, and it really helps dress things up a little bit more than a hard plastic insert would. It also gives the door a bit more visual depth. Let me know what you think about that. I really like the design, whether we're talking about this or in the XC40. On the dashboard, rather than metal or wood trim, we instead find plastic trim, sort of a geometric pattern going on there, and we find the same just over 9-inch LCD infotainment system here in the dash that we find in most but not all Volvos for 2022. This is now running the latest Google operating system based on Android. Rather unfortunately, it still does not support CarPlay or Android Auto interfaces, so it does come across as a little bit half-baked. But the mapping interface here is very well done. This is basically using Google's mapping interface, just like you'd find on your computer or on your smartphone, coupled with data from the vehicle. So you can see right now, if I were to go to the office right there, it's 30 miles. I'd end up with 14% battery there. And if I were to voice command a longer destination, it will even include charging. So let's go ahead and do that. Take me to Los Angeles.
Los Angeles, all right.
The vehicle knows that charging is going to be required, so it's going to say multiple charges needed. So we go ahead and add the charges there. It's going to need several charges because the battery is fairly low at the moment. And of course, it doesn't go quite as far as some folks might like on a battery charge. But it is going to give you the optimum routing here. So you can see we're going to need to go 33 minutes at this charger. We're going to arrive at 14%. We're going to arrive there at 12%, etc. And the vehicle is programmed to take you to your final destination with a charge left on the battery. So it's not going to have you arrive empty. It's actually going to schedule one last charging session there, so that way you're not completely empty when you get there. The rest of the interior is pretty similar to the XC40. We have some controls for the infotainment system, 2 USB ports there. Theoretically, one would work with smartphone integration once we have that feature. We have a Qi wireless charging mat there, 2 big cup holders, and a joystick style shifter, but there is no B mode for enhanced regen braking. If you want to control things like regen braking or the mode for the adaptive cruise control system, you have to control that all here within the infotainment software. The full LCD cluster is pretty much the same as we find in other modern Volvos. There are only 2 basic looks here. You can turn the moving map display inside on or off. You can also pop up a trip computer readout, but that's pretty much it. This 3-spoke steering wheel is shared with the XC40. Over here on the left side of the steering wheel, we find the controls for the adaptive cruise control system. Again, oddly enough, these buttons do not change the mode of the cruise control system. In fact, they really don't do anything at all. Over here on the right side, we find controls for the infotainment system, volume up, down, track forward, backward. This center button pulls up your trip computer, but it also hangs up the phone. And oddly enough, you cannot change map views or pull up the trip computer while you're on the phone, so definitely keep that in mind. If you're talking and you accidentally push that button, it's just going to hang up on your collar. A lot of folks were asking about this, but no, the C40 does not have a start-stop button on the dashboard. Instead, it just has a little plastic plug where that start button would go. To turn on the vehicle, you simply hop in, belt yourself up, and then pull back on the shifter. If you want to turn the car off, you hit the park button, and then you just leave the car and lock it. A particular vehicle's 0 to 60 time has always been more than just the raw horsepower and torque figures, and always more than simply power to weight ratio as well. It's a matter of how that power is applied, through the transmission in a regular gasoline vehicle and through traction in pretty much any vehicle. But with electric vehicles, there's an additional twist, because the manufacturer, Volvo in this case, could choose to allow the electric motor full power right away, or they could choose to dial up that power from the battery a little bit more gradually in order to help improve durability, wear, and of course, keep from spinning the rubber right off the tires. The result of the ability to tweak that in software is the big reason that in EVs, power to weight ratio does not always correlate to 0 to 60 time. This particular model comes in at around 4,800 pounds of curb weight. It's a few hundred pounds heavier than the EV6, but the 0 to 60 times are honestly pretty close, even though this produces more power, 402 horsepower versus 320 horsepower in the EV6, a particular version of the GV60, and of course the Ioniq 5. 4.2 seconds 0 to 60 is definitely a respectable time for a modern EV. You will go a little bit faster in certain versions of the Polestar 2 and just a hair slower, about 1/10 slower in the XC40 Recharge. And that's mainly down to the way that Volvo and Polestar have chosen to tune the software on what is essentially an identical drivetrain. The ability for manufacturers to tune their 0 to 60 time is really obvious when you start taking a look at the competition. You will find, for instance, vehicles like the Hyundai Ioniq 5 that can do 0 to 60 in 4.4 seconds, even though their power to weight ratio is really pretty similar to this vehicle. They are a little bit lighter, but produces 320 horsepower, not 402. We find pretty similar 0 to 60 times in the new BMW i4, with varying different power levels in that particular vehicle. And of course, we find pretty quick acceleration times in something like the Tesla Model Y. Tesla tends to be incredibly aggressive at dialing up the power profile of the electric motors very rapidly, and that's why we find incredibly swift 0 to 60 times in their vehicles, regardless of what the horsepower total might end up being and how that might compare to the competition. In my 60 to 0 stopping test, it took just 119 feet for this to stop from 60 miles an hour back to 0. That is a little bit longer than some competitors that I've driven recently, and it likely has to do with the fact that this has two 35 width tires up front. It has pretty wide tires in the back, but Volvo interestingly chose not to give this a symmetrical tire setup. I suspect that some of that was in order to give this a more predictable feel out on the road. Handling is excellent in the C40, but when you start to push this a little bit harder, you'll definitely notice that the front end loses grip a little bit before the rear end, and that gives this that more predictable feel. Volvo does choose to send a little bit more power to the rear axle under certain conditions, so if I'm just partial throttle around this corner, you can get the rear end to steer just a little bit around, but then if I go around this corner, which is a little bit more gradual, and then floor it, then you'll notice that it sort of just pushes to the side because both electric motors are delivering equal amounts of power. Possibly due to Volvo's obsession with safety, and possibly due to the relationship between this and the regular gasoline versions of the platform, this does manage to be several hundred pounds heavier than some direct competitors that are on more dedicated EV platforms. For instance, you'll find the larger GV60, it's going to be a little bit lighter than this, and it's going to be a little bit roomier on the inside depending on the dimension that you're taking a look at. Volvo did an excellent job designing the chassis and the suspension in the C40, but when you push this a little bit harder out on your favorite winding road, you'll notice that the curb weight is certainly a little bit heavier than some of the competition, the front tires a little bit less grippy, and we have significantly higher ground clearance than we find in most of the competition. The vast majority of EVs, crossover or not, are well under 6 inches of ground clearance. This has 7 inches of ground clearance, and you'll find even more in the XC40 Recharge. Now, that clearly makes this more practical in snow, rough road situations, if you wanted to take your vehicle a little bit further off the beaten path, etc., but it does hamper on-road handling ability. Grip numbers could of course be improved by putting grippier tires on the C40 generally and wider tires up front. I suspect if I had one of these, that's exactly what I would do. Volvo does have a really nicely sorted steering rack here. The steering feel is pretty good. There's just a hint of torque steer. If you floor this in a corner, that's hard to avoid when we're talking about this much power and a symmetrical motor setup, but it's really well controlled in the C40. I do find it interesting that safety-obsessed Volvo, the company that has decided to limit top speed in all their vehicles to just under 120 miles an hour, has decided to make their electric vehicles so much fun, and they keep adding more and more power. We now have a plug-in hybrid system with 455 horsepower, and we have an electric vehicle here with 402 horsepower, and 0 to 60 times just barely over 4 seconds. This is an awful lot of fun out on the road, and I would say, as far as the general competition in the luxury segment goes, this is the most fun, keeping in mind that I haven't driven the GV60 yet. That model accepted, if I were shopping for a small luxury crossover right now, the C40 would absolutely be at the top of my list. Out on a rougher road surface, the more European tuning, I guess you'd say, to the C40 is obvious versus something like an Ioniq 5 or a GV60 or an EV6, which are all honestly around the same price range as this C40. Of course, the C40 starts where a lot of those models, especially the Hyundai and the Kia, leave off, but I could still see them as valid competitors. Unlike some luxury options, the C40 does not have an adaptive suspension system, so this is always going to feel just one way. It soaks up larger imperfections pretty well, but you will feel some of the smaller imperfections come through into the cabin. The other thing you'll notice out on a gravel road like this is the symmetrical motor setup. If I floor it, all 4 tires start spinning immediately in low traction situations. So it's really obvious that Volvo is being really aggressive at splitting power essentially 50-50. Now there are going to be times out on the road, as I said before, where power is going to be more rear biased, but that's generally going to be when the car knows that you're trying to drive it harder and that's what you expect out of it. Volvo has done a really good job programming the power control systems and the stability and traction control systems to send power exactly where you need it when you want it. Now on to the downsides. Cabin noise, it could be a little bit quieter in here. I measured 73 decibels in this cabin at 50 miles an hour. That actually makes this one of the loudest electric vehicles that I have tested here at Alex and Autos. I'd actually expected this to be a little bit quieter because at the launch event it didn't really appear to be that loud, but out on the regular road surface that we test everything else on, 73 decibels. That is significantly louder than a lot of mainstream electric vehicles. I suspect it might have to do with the tire choice because there's definitely a reasonable amount of road noise coming into the cabin. Wind noise is well controlled, road noise, not so much. The other thing you should know is efficiency. This is not the most efficient EV that I have tested recently. On my road trip range test, I ended up with 203 miles of real-world range. Now that's not as far off the window sticker as some EVs that I've tested recently, but I have to say it's still a little bit disappointing. I had really hoped that when Volvo released the C40, they would also release a tweaked drivetrain with maybe a front axle disconnect like we find in some of the competition, or more efficient electric motors, etc., but they didn't end up doing that in the C40. Because the Polestar 2 is a little bit more aerodynamic than this, it will go a little bit further on a charge, and the XC40 Recharge, it's a little bit less aerodynamic than this, so it's a few miles lower in terms of its real-world range. 203 miles in my road trip range test means that this vehicle averaged 2.7 miles per kilowatt hour, and that's actually below what we find in the BMW iX, with significantly more power, and it's a significantly larger vehicle as well. When it comes to electric vehicle road trips, a lot of people think that you're going to spend more time charging than you really are. For instance, on the 246-mile road trip, the car wanted me to charge for 20 minutes at a DC fast charge station. But to be perfectly honest, if all I wanted to do was get back to my starting point and then I could plug in there and wait for it to get fully charged, I would only have had to spend about 7 minutes at that DC fast charge station. I ultimately opted to spend 22 minutes at the DC fast charge station because I wanted enough battery to get me back to my destination and then round trip to home and then back to the office. So by the time I ended up back at the office, I still had an extra 60 miles of range left, and that only took 24 minutes of charging. Now don't get me wrong, I'm not discounting range anxiety, it definitely is real, and it's something that eventually most EV owners are going to have to face. But Volvo and Google do a pretty good job of trying to alleviate that as much as possible by the way they've done their mapping and charging interface. The C40 is stylish, easy to live with, and compared to other EVs, it won't break the bank, starting just over $55,000 and ending right around $55,000 as well, plus of course tax, title, license, and destination. It is a few $100s more expensive than a comparably equipped XC40, but the key thing to know there is that the regular XC40 Recharge has several different trim levels, and there's just one in the C40, the top end one. So if you're looking at the price tags and you want to spend less, you're going to have to get the XC40, but if you're looking at a fully loaded XC40 Recharge, you do have a tough decision. Do you want the slightly higher efficiency in the C40 with the sexier style, and I think definitely better looking tail lamps, or do you want a slightly more practical cargo area, which is what you find in the XC40? My only quibble with the C40 is highway fuel economy. I do think that could be better. Hopefully it's something that Volvo is working on. If you want to know more about the C40's pricing and how it stacks up against its more direct competition, be sure and check out that video. You'll find a link at the end of this video and down there in the description as well. We're going to be separating these videos out into separate buyer's guide sections that we can hopefully keep up to date every year. So as Volvo releases pricing updates for 2024, as long as there are no substantive changes, we will then try and release a separate version of that video for 2024, for 2025, etc., and then update the main review whenever the vehicle itself actually changes. Be sure and click that button. You'll find it at the bottom right corner of your screen at the end of this video. Links down there in the description as well. Let me know what you think about the C40, and would you buy the C40 or the XC40 if you were cross-shopping these? It's also worth noting that by the time I'm recording this extra to the video, Volvo has finally added CarPlay to the C40. Hallelujah, it's finally there. So if you're worried about that, know that that does exist at the moment. I'll see all of you later.